Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're trying to get to the bottom of a question that, when you first hear it, seems almost absurd on its face.
It does.
Why are we, Homo sapiens, the dominant species on this planet? The obvious answer is always intelligent.
Right, we're the smartest.
Exactly. But that's really only part of the story.
Yeah.
And you could argue it was the most expensive, riskiest part. For millions of years, we were evolving this capacity for, calculus and complex thought.
Uh-huh.
While at the same time, we were physically weaker than a chimpanzee. Our whole existence is basically defined by this massive biological bet, yet for a very long time gave us almost no immediate survival benefit.
It's a fantastic paradox, and I think the sources you've pulled together for this just synthesize the entire history so beautifully. They show that the real engine of human civilization, it wasn't muscle, it wasn't even immediate smarts.
No.
It was our ability to create, and this is the key part, to rigorously enforce a shared belief in things that simply don't exist in objective reality.
Fictions.
Fictions, exactly.
That's right. So this deep dive, which was commissioned by you, the learner, is synthesizing material that, fundamentally questions the major milestones of human history. We're going from the high price of our evolutionary success all the way to the origins of agriculture, money, and empires.
And how those fictions still run our world today.
Absolutely. Our mission here is to unpack the costly trade-offs our ancestors made, to reveal how these collective myths became the very foundation of modern reality, and to explore why some of history's biggest revolutions might have felt, to the people actually living through them, more like a great mistake than progress.
It's a fascinating and, frankly, a much more realistic way of looking at our own history.
I agree. Okay, let's dig into the biology that made all of this even possible. So when we talk about human evolution, the large brain is always, it's presented as this inevitable crowning achievement, massive advantage.
The end goal of evolution, right?
Yeah, but the sources we're looking at, they make it crystal clear that for archaic humans, this jumbo brain was basically a jumbo drain. It was an incredibly expensive, almost crippling biological burden.
It's so important to understand just how financially reckless that evolutionary strategy was. I mean, if a giant brain were the obvious key to immediate survival, you'd think we would have seen huge-headed apex predators everywhere.
Right, you'd see giant-brained lions or something.
Exactly, but the costs were immediate, and they were profound. Let's just look at the sheer metabolic drain. The brain in Homo sapiens accounts for only, 2 to 3% of our total body weight?
It's tiny.
But when the body is completely at rest, just sitting there, that single organ consumes a devastating 25% of our entire energy budget.
25%.
Yeah.
1/4 of everything you consume just to keep the lights on and the system idling.
Yeah.
That's just so disproportionate.
It's completely off the charts. Now, you compare that figure 1/4 of our resting energy to other great apes. Their brains, on average, demand only about 8% of their rest time energy.
8%? That's a huge difference.
It's massive. So to sustain this 25% drain, archaic humans had to make some very serious sacrifices. According to the sources, they paid this price in two really distinct ways. First, they were forced to spend significantly more time and energy just looking for food.
Just to feed the brain.
Just to feed the brain. Hunting, gathering, foraging, whatever it took to satisfy that insatiable demand for calories. And second, they suffered muscle atrophy across the rest of the body.
So it's not just some kind of philosophical trade-off. It's a direct physiological diversion of resources. We literally traded muscle mass for processing power.
Think of it like a national government that has permanently diverted enormous funds from infrastructure and defense, which is our musculature, into a single, massive, and incredibly resource-intensive research facility, our cognition.
And on the dangerous, resource-scarce savanna, that sounds like a terrible short-term plan.
It was disastrous in the short term. The sources, they highlight this almost comical irony. An early Homo sapiens was evolving the capacity for abstract thought, sure, but they could not win a physical fight with a chimpanzee. The quote is that the ape can rip the man apart like a rag doll.
So if that cognitive advantage didn't immediately translate into better tools or, complex cooperation, and we know that took millions of years to really stabilize, why wasn't that big brain immediately selected against? Why would nature tolerate such a massive, inefficient energy sink for so long?
Because the payoff, while it was incredibly delayed, was unique. I mean, for nearly 2 million years, our large neural networks yielded, as one source puts it, precious little to show for it beyond, a crude flint knife.
A slightly better rock.
A slightly better rock. Survival was a day-to-day, brutal grind. The big brain only started yielding those massive dividends when we finally developed true long-range weaponry, traps, and this is key, complex multi-band cooperation.
So things that came much, much later.
Much later. Our current dominance relies on being able to hit a target from a safe distance, use a car to outrun a predator, or fire a gun. These technologies are brand new in an evolutionary sense. The gamble was huge, and for a very long time, the odds looked absolutely terrible.
That sets the stage perfectly for the second great evolutionary dilemma that just piled more costs onto the human form. Bipedalism. Walking upright.
Right. Another one of those things we see as a pure advantage.
And it gave us advantages, for sure. A lofty vision, great for scouting. And it freed our hands to become industrious tool users. But the sources really stress the severe disadvantages. Chronic issues like backaches and stiff necks that, well, still plague us today.
And this new style of movement, it imposed a particularly cruel constraint on human females, what the sources call the birth canal crisis.
The birth canal crisis.
Yeah. Walking upright requires a very specific pelvic structure. You need narrower hips to maintain an efficient bipedal gait. But this constriction of the birth canal was happening at the exact same evolutionary moment that infants' heads were growing larger and larger because of that resource-hungry brain.
That is a perfect storm of anatomical contradiction.
It's exactly that. Death in childbirth became an overwhelming, life-threatening hazard for human females. Natural selection couldn't just easily widen the hips without sacrificing the efficiency of walking upright, but it also couldn't shrink the infants' heads without sacrificing the intellectual future of the species.
So it was stuck. Natural selection had to find a workaround, a compromise, by basically altering the entire human life cycle.
And it chose early birth. That was the solution. Compared to almost all other mammals, human babies are born profoundly, dangerously premature.
And when you see it in comparison, it's really stark.
It is. I mean, think about it. A colt can stand and trot within hours of being born. A kitten can start foraging and learning to hunt within weeks. Human infants. They remain utterly helpless and totally dependent for years and years. They need constant specialized care, protection, and food well into their childhood.
And this dependency, this is the crucial link, isn't it? Because it's the biological reality that then necessitated a whole new level of social structure.
It is the biological engine that forces sociality. A lone human mother, or even a mother supported just by a partner, could hardly forage or hunt enough to feed herself, and a helpless child who can't walk or even cling on for long distances.
It's just not viable.
It's not. This necessity elevated the social requirements for survival. So that old adage, it takes a tribe to raise a human, that wasn't a moral philosophy. It became a hard biological fact. Evolution began to select for individuals who were capable of maintaining strong cooperative bonds with neighbors, with grandparents, with non-kin, the whole tribe.
So the cost of the brain and the cost of bipedalism, together, they forced us into becoming these intensely social creatures. And this unfinished state at birth, it has another profound implication, what the sources call educational freedom.
Yes. Because human babies are born so underdeveloped, their neural pathways and their behavior patterns are far less fixed than in other species. The sources use this fantastic analogy here.
I love this one.
Most mammals, they say, emerge from the womb like glazed earthenware coming out of a kiln. They're fixed. Any attempt to substantially reshape them will just result in scratches or breakage.
But humans are different.
Humans emerge like molten glass from a furnace. We can be spun, stretched, and shaped with a surprising degree of freedom for years and years after birth. And this biological plasticity, it means a human child can be shaped to become a Christian, a Buddhist, a capitalist, a socialist, warlike, or peace-loving, all depending on the culture they're born into. Our biology handed our culture immense power to mold us. And, if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, that original jumbo drain problem, that 25% energy consumption.
Right, how do we solve that?
Well, it was eventually mitigated not just by social support, but by a piece of technology, specifically cooking.
The culinary link, yes. The sources suggest that solving that energy crisis required more than just finding more calories. It was about processing them much more efficiently.
Cooking allowed humans to do three critical, mutually beneficial things. First, Pretty obviously, it made previously indigestible foods, like certain tough tubers or older meat, edible.
Expanded the menu.
Exactly. Second, it dramatically reduced the time we had to spend just chewing and digesting raw food. That freed up hours every day for other activities. And third, and this is the most crucial part, it facilitated the shortening of the human intestinal tract.
And why is the shortening of the intestines so important in this whole equation?
Because the digestive system is also a massive energy consumer. It's another huge drain on the body. Long intestines and a large brain are both colossal energy hogs. So by shortening the intestines, which we could do thanks to the pre-digestion offered by cooking, we decrease the body's overall energy consumption.
So we took energy from the gut and diverted it to the head.
In a sense, yes, the energy trade-off worked. Reducing the energy required for digestion inadvertently opened the way to the jumbo brains of Neanderthals and Sapiens. We subsidized the brain by shrinking the gut. It's an incredible biological bargain.
Okay, so by the time we get to the cognitive revolution, we have this creature with a large, expensive brain, a painful bipedal stance, and this high requirement for social cooperation. But even with all this superior intelligence, the early Homo sapiens cooperation was fundamentally loose, wasn't it?
Very loose. Foragers lived in these small bands. They roamed vast territories that were influenced by the climate and animal migrations. It was a very fluid existence.
So what was the limiting factor?
Well, it's because even with the better communication tools that came with the cognitive revolution, our intimate social cooperation is still limited by the biological constraints of our brains. We are wired to track personal relationships, debts, favors, histories, who's trustworthy, who isn't.
And there's a hard ceiling on that.
There's a very hard ceiling. The critical threshold for a complex, stable social group that's maintained purely by personal familiarity is famously around 150 individuals.
The Dunbar number, essentially.
Oh.
Everyone has a limit on how many people they can genuinely know and track their relationship with.
Exactly that. You can run a small military platoon or a family farm based on knowing everyone's personal history and their trustworthiness. But as the sources point out, you simply cannot run a military division with thousands of soldiers or a massive, complex corporation in the same way. So the big question is, if biology capped us at 150, how did we ever overcome that limit and found cities and empires that ruled millions?
The secret weapon, what the sources call the appearance of fiction.
It was the ability to tell stories, and crucially, the ability for large numbers of absolute strangers to cooperate successfully by believing in the same common myths.
It's not just telling stories, it's the shared belief.
The shared belief is everything. Whether it's the belief in a specific god, or the value of a piece of stamped metal, or the authority of a national flag, these fictions provide the necessary communal glue to coordinate mass action way beyond the constraints of personal knowledge.
And this is where it gets, I think, really interesting. The introduction of fiction meant that sapiens began living in a dual reality. And this isn't just a metaphor, it's like the operating system of civilization.
It is. Since the cognitive revolution, we simultaneously inhabit two distinct worlds. First, there's the objective reality. This is the world of rivers, trees, lions, and gravity things that exist and operate completely independent of human consciousness or belief.
Right. If we all stop believing in a river, it still flows.
It still flows. But second, there is the imagined reality. This is the world of gods, nations, corporations, and human rights. These things only exist because we collectively believe them to be real. If we all stopped believing in the US dollar tomorrow, it would become a worthless piece of paper.
And the sources suggest that over time, the imagined reality has systematically eclipsed the objective one. It's become more powerful.
It's a profound and, frankly, terrifying shift. As time went by, the imagined reality became progressively more powerful. So much so that today, the very survival of the objective reality, the physical rivers, the trees, the lions, depends entirely on what the sources call the grace of imagined entities.
So a corporation's decision can destroy a forest.
Exactly. A giant corporation, which is a legal fiction or a global trade agreement, another fiction, or the environmental policies of a nation state, yet another fiction, these things determine whether a rainforest lives or dies, or whether a species survives. We invented entities to help us manage nature, and now nature is completely dependent on those inventions.
And we can actually track the evolution of these belief systems way back into the foraging era, even before mass empires needed a universal currency or a grand legal code.
We can. The initial pace of change for early archaic humans, like, say, Homo erectus, was glacial. I mean, their tools remained largely unchanged for nearly 2 million years.
2 million years. That's almost impossible to comprehend.
It is, and it strongly implies that their early social and technological shifts were driven more by slow genetic mutations and environmental pressures than by any kind of rapid cultural or ideological leaps. But as sapiens emerged, we start to see clear archaeological evidence of complex social structures and developing beliefs.
Let's talk about some of that evidence, like the evidence for early hierarchy and collective effort, like the Sungir burial site.
The Sungir site in Russia is just remarkable. It's a 30,000-year-old mammoth hunter site. And in one grave, they found the skeleton of a 50-year-old man. He was covered with a staggering 3,000 strings of mammoth ivory beads.
3,000.
3,000, plus a hat that was decorated with fox teeth and 25 heavy ivory bracelets on his wrists. Now, just stop and think about the effort required to make that.
3,000 beads, each one needing to be carefully carved and polished, plus gathering all those fox teeth. This suggests a massive collective labor investment.
Precisely. This kind of elaborate display, especially when you contrast it with other graves from the same period that contain far fewer goods, it strongly suggests a hierarchical society. He was a recognized leader, or a chief, whose status was confirmed by the immense resources the group dedicated to his burial.
And that level of dedication, it requires a collective belief that extends far beyond an immediate 150-person band, doesn't it?
It has to. It implies a societal organization that involves several cooperative bands uniting for seasonal hunts, or in this case, for major ritual purposes. It's an early imagined order in action.
And the evidence isn't just about hierarchy, it's also about deep emotional connections, maybe even the very beginning of domestication.
You see that so clearly at the 12,000-year-old tomb they found in northern Israel. It's a 50-year-old woman. She was buried, and lying right next to her head was the complete skeleton of a puppy, and her hand was resting on the dog.
Wow.
Now, archaeologists always have to consider the pragmatic explanations. Maybe the puppy was a sacrifice for the gatekeeper of the next world or something like that. But it's very hard to deny the possibility of an intense emotional bond there. It shows that life and death rituals were already incorporating other species into the human world in a very significant personal way.
So what about the wider belief structure of these early foragers? The sources point pretty strongly toward animism.
Yes. Animism, in its most basic form, is the belief that nearly every element of the natural world, every place, every animal, every plant, every natural phenomenon, has awareness, has feelings, and has the capacity to communicate directly with humans.
So a rock might have desires. An oak tree is an animated being with its own spirit.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some primitive superstition. It was a complex, negotiated social contract with the entire world.
So if you were an animist, you weren't just exploiting nature. You were in a constant dialogue with a world full of sentient beings.
Yes, and that belief imposed immediate social constraints and boundaries on your behavior. You might have very strict rules forbidding you from cutting down a particular fig tree because you fear angering its spirit, which could then bring bad luck or sickness to your village.
Or maybe certain animals were off limits.
For sure. Maybe a white-tailed fox once revealed the location of precious obsidian, or it offered advice in a dream. It established this spiritual and ecological relationship of reciprocity, which, by the way, often enforced some pretty effective conservation practices. These early fictions helped manage not just human social behavior, but human interaction with the objective world itself.
The cognitive revolution gave us the software fiction to cooperate on a larger scale. But the next major societal shift was the agricultural revolution, the AR. And for generations, we've all learned the traditional narrative.
The story of progress.
The story of progress. The AR was humanity's great leap forward. It's a tale of smarter people finally deciphering nature's secrets and then cheerfully abandoning the grueling life of the hunter-gatherer for the, quote, pleasant, satiated life of farmers.
It's a comforting narrative, but the sources we're looking at, they deeply challenge it. The reality is that the AR was neither swift nor was it cheerful. It proceeded through these tiny, gradual alterations over thousands and thousands of years.
It wasn't a single event.
Not at all. And we know that Homo sapiens flourished in the Middle East for 50,000 years without agriculture. They were adapting their fertility rates using hormonal and genetic mechanisms, earlier puberty in good times, decreased fertility in bad times, to manage the resources around them. They weren't starving and desperate. They were thriving through adaptation.
So if they weren't starving, why on earth did they adopt farming? The sources offer what they call the miscalculation theory, which
Mm.
is based on one of history's great iron laws.
Which is that luxuries tend to become necessities, and those necessities then spawn new obligations.
It's the trap of dependence.
It's the trap of dependence. Think about it this way, and let's use a modern analogy. We acquire time-saving devices, a mobile phone, email, a washing machine. The original intent is to save time and effort.
To make life easier.
Right. We saved ourselves the trouble of writing a long letter, but are we more relaxed today? No, of course not, because expectations immediately rose, and all of that saved time is instantly filled by new obligations, new expectations, and new digital demands. We're busier than ever.
So early farmers started cultivating a little bit of wheat, maybe as a temporary luxury, a convenient source of food right near their campsite, or just a buffer against a bad winter.
Exactly. And those small, seemingly harmless initial alterations, just throwing a few seeds onto some fertile ground, inadvertently locked them into a cycle of dependence. They began to rely on that wheat, which then demanded immense effort. Clearing stones, weeding constantly, scaring off birds, guarding the fields from animals. The pursuit of an easier life resulted in a much, much harder life.
Filled with new anxiety.
New anxieties and the massive new risk of being dependent on a single demanding crop that required them to stay in one place. That led to increased population density, which in turn led to the rapid spread of disease. The agricultural revolution, from this perspective, was a massive miscalculation.
Maybe the motivation wasn't purely economic. What's so fascinating here is the possibility that people were actually willing to make their lives materially harder to achieve some non-economic, non-material goal. And this brings us to the astonishing archaeological site of Göbekli Tepe.
The temple theory of the AR is just revolutionary because scientists, they typically default to materialist explanations. It's always about food, it's always about population, because we don't have written documents from these prolific cultures.
Right, you go with the evidence you have.
But Göbekli Tepe, which has been excavated in southeast Turkey since 1995, it challenges this entirely. The site contained no signs of a typical settlement. There were no houses, no ovens, no traces of daily domestic activities. What they found were these monumental pillared structures.
And describe the scale of this structure for us.
These are massive T-shaped pillars. They stand up to 5 meters tall and they weigh up to 7 tons each. And in a nearby quarry, they discovered a half-chiseled pillar weighing a staggering 50 tons, just abandoned but ready to be moved.
50 tons.
Yeah.
We are talking about immense engineering and collective labor organized by people who, according to the old narrative, were supposed to be simple, roaming hunter-gatherers.
This level of organization and construction, it just screams of a monumental shared aspiration, a shared fiction, and the connection of farming.
This is the key.
This is the key. Domesticated einkorn wheat, which is one of the earliest domesticated crops we know of, originated in the Karasadag Hills, only 30 kilometers away from Göbekli Tepe. The implication is staggering. Foragers may have switched to intensive wheat cultivation not to increase their normal day-to-day food supply,
But to feed the builders.
but to support the building and running of a temple.
The temple came first, and the village grew up around it to sustain the priests and the construction workers.
It flips the entire script. Ideology, religion, a shared myth, these may have been the primary drivers of the economic revolution, not the other way around. These foragers might have willingly settled down, endured the back-breaking drudgery of farming, and risked starvation, all just to ensure the upkeep of their monumental sacred site. It just shows the incredible power of fiction to motivate and coordinate human energy.
That raises a really important question. If the agricultural revolution was a catastrophe, or at least a severe miscalculation for humans' trading, diet quality, and free time for population growth, what was its impact on the domesticated animals?
From the perspective of the animals themselves, it was undoubtedly a terrible catastrophe, one of immense individual suffering that continues to this very day. The AR fundamentally changed their religious status. They went from being, equal members of the spiritual roundtable of animism, where their spirit's needs had to be negotiated with.
Right, where you had to ask the deer for permission.
Exactly. They went from that to becoming mere property. Farmers did not negotiate with their possessions, they commanded them.
And this created that terrible paradox of evolutionary success coupled with profound individual misery. Species like cattle and swine are numerically incredibly successful. There are billions of them today.
Billions. Yet the sources argue that numerical success is bought at the terrible cost of individual well-being. A rare wild rhinoceros, maybe on the brink of extinction, is probably far more satisfied with its life than a cat that spends its entire short existence locked inside a tiny box. The species thrives, but the individual suffers immeasurably.
And the process of taming, the shift from a wild animal to an obedient piece of property, that was inherently brutal, wasn't it? It relied on breaking the animal's natural spirit.
Absolutely. To turn these animals into obedient draft animals or passive food sources, their natural instincts, their social ties, their aggression, it all had to be systematically broken. This meant pens, harnesses, whips, and systematic mutilation. Castration was standard practice to eliminate male aggression and control procreation. And we see specific, just horrifying examples of deliberate cruelty used to ensure their dependence.
Tell us about those examples from the sources.
Farmers in New Guinea, for instance, have a practice of slicing a chunk off a pig's nose. This causes severe pain whenever the pig tries to do what pigs do, sniff the ground. And since pigs rely entirely on sniffing to find food and navigate, this mutilation makes them completely dependent on their human owners for survival.
That is just, it's horrifying.
Other historical practices involved gouging out their eyes so they couldn't find their way home or escape. It just underscores how quickly the new imagined order, the fiction that humans own and command animals, de-animalize these creatures in our own minds.
That example of the pig's noses is genuinely awful. It forces you to just pause and reflect on how quickly the security and the perceived prosperity of our imagined order required the systematic subjugation of every other living creature.
And that subjugation tragically persists and has been industrialized in modern farming. You just have to consider the modern industrial meat farm calf. It's separated from its mother immediately after birth and then locked in a tiny cage not much bigger than its own body for about 4 months.
And why? For a specific outcome.
Right. For a very specific outcome. It is prevented from walking or interacting with other calves. That's so its muscles stay soft and underdeveloped for a tender, juicy steak. The first chance that animal has to walk, to stretch its muscles, or to feel the sun on its back is typically on the truck on the way to the slaughterhouse. The efficiency of the AR, extended by industrialization, created production machines out of living creatures.
So the agricultural revolution forced people into these larger, denser settlements. But their biological limit for cooperation was still stuck, capped at about 150. So to manage these new, massive kingdoms and empires, the imagined orders had to be codified, they had to be institutionalized, and above all, they had to be maintained. And maintaining a myth takes a tremendous continuous effort.
It's not a one-and-done thing. Unlike a natural order, which sustains itself, gravity does not require our belief to function. An imagined order is inherently fragile. It is constantly in danger of collapsing.
So you have to prop it up.
You have to constantly prop it up. Continuous, strenuous efforts are absolutely imperative to safeguard it. You need standing armies, police forces, courts, prisons, and constant religious or patriotic indoctrination to force millions of people to act in accordance with the myth. Or, in fact, human beings. It still required a bloody civil war to force the southern states to acquiesce to that foundational notion of equality.
So cynicism doesn't build empires. The collective, both the elite and the masses, they have to genuinely believe in the foundational fiction.
They really do. Whether it's belief in Christ for Christianity, or belief in human rights for American democracy, or the belief in the future profitability of capital for the modern economy, belief is the engine.
And we can see how two very different societies, separated by millennia, use the exact same rationale, that stability is achieved through belief, to codify vastly different hierarchies. We can contrast the Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon with the American Declaration of Independence.
It's a fantastic comparison.
Hammurabi's code, from around 1776 BC, was a masterwork of codified hierarchy. It explicitly established different fines and punishments based entirely on a person's class: superior man, commoner, and slave.
Right. For instance, the law details the consequence if a superior man strikes a superior woman, causing a miscarriage. He pays 10 shekels of silver. But if she dies from the blow, the law says they shall kill his daughter.
A life for a life, but notice the transfer of status there.
Exactly. Now, if that same superior man strikes a commoner woman, causing a miscarriage, he pays only 5 shekels. If she dies, he pays 30 shekels of silver. The law explicitly placed a higher value on the life of a superior man's daughter than on the entire life of a commoner woman.
And they justified this.
The whole structure was justified not by nature, but by the logic of their imagined order. The argument was, if we believe that society is hierarchical, it will enable us to create a stable and prosperous society. Hierarchy, they argued, created stability.
Okay, now jump forward 3,500 years to the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. An imagined order built on the radical opposite fiction of universal equality.
And the irony here is just so profound. If you strip away the religious or creation myth that underpins both of these documents, the idea of divine ordination, and you try to translate their language into pure biology, the language just struggles.
It falls apart.
It falls apart. Created equal becomes evolved differently. Liberty, which is a non-existent concept in biology, and the pursuit of happiness, which is highly abstract and undefined, ultimately they just collapse back down to life and the pursuit of pleasure. Both Hammurabi and Jefferson argued that their respective fictions, one of fixed hierarchy, one of equality, were necessary to create stability and prosperity.
So laws and rights are these complex, powerful myths that organize vast populations. But money is arguably the most universal and most efficient myth of all. It solved the limitations of small economies that were based on favors, obligations, and barter.
Money is pure, universal trust. In a small foraging band, the economy runs on personal favors. You know, I shared my pill with you today, so you owe me your medical help next week.
A social ledger.
A social ledger.
Yeah.
And barter economies, like the classic example of the apple grower needing shoes, they face the problem of coincidence. You have to find someone who needs apples and who also happens to have shoes available for trade right now. Money just bypassed all of this with two incredibly powerful principles: universal convertibility and universal trust.
Universal convertibility, meaning that money can, conceptually at least, turn anything into anything else.
Precisely. It turns land into loyalty, or justice into healthcare, or an hour of labor into a loaf of bread. But the real genius is universal trust. That's what allows any two strangers, a Mesopotamian merchant and an Egyptian farmer, for instance, to cooperate successfully. The sources call money the most universal and most efficient system of mutual trust ever devised. You don't have to trust the person, you only need to trust the token itself.
And you can trace that monetary evolution for us from something tangible to something purely conceptual.
Sure. We started with what's called commodity money, like barley in ancient Mesopotamia. Barley had intrinsic value, you could eat it. And that made it easier for people to trust, but it was difficult to store, it was hard to transport, and it was tough to divide accurately. The real conceptual breakthrough came in the mid-3rd millennium BC with the silver shekel. This wasn't a coin, it was just a fixed weight, 8.33 grams of silver.
And silver isn't intrinsically valuable in a biological sense. You can't eat it, it's too soft for serious tools. Its value is purely a status symbol, a cultural agreement.
That's the key psychological leap. The ability to trust money that lacked any inherent biological or practical value, that was the foundation of all finance. And this cultural agreement eventually led to the first true coins, which were struck around 640 BC by King Alyattes of Lydia. These were standardized weights of gold or silver, stamped with an identification mark or a guarantee.
A seal of approval.
A seal of approval. And this system worked because everyone, regardless of their local tribe or religion, trusted the universal standard of gold and silver. They trusted what the sources call the gospel of gold.
And that trust was genuinely transnational, long before global empires had fully solidified.
Absolutely. The Roman denarius, for example, was an accepted medium of exchange far beyond the empire's boundaries, even deep into India. Why? Because everyone trusted the underlying value of the silver in the coin. This reliance created a single, transnational, transcultural monetary zone.
And this continued for centuries.
It did. When 16th century conquistadors shipped all that gold from the Americas back to Europe, most of it didn't even stay in European treasuries.
It went straight to Asia.
It just slipped through European hands and traveled across the world, accepted eagerly by merchants in India and China in exchange for silk, porcelain, and spices. Gold acted as the universal language, knitting the global economy together seamlessly.
This expansion, driven by economic trust, brings us to the third great imagined order, the empire. Now, empires, despite the immense brutality of their creation, they share an inclusive ideology. They recognize a basic unity of the world and the mutual responsibilities of its inhabitants. And this contrasts really sharply with the ethnic exclusiveness of local tribes.
It does. Local tribes often define themselves as the real people. The word Dinka means people, Nuer means original people, and Yupik means real people. Everyone else is, by definition, a barbarian or not fully human. Empires, by contrast, necessarily demand integration and a shared culture just to function.
And this demand for integration leads to this most fascinating historical cycle, which is exemplified by what the sources call the Numantian paradox.
Oh, this is a great story. The Romans besieged the small Celtic town of Numantia in Spain for over a year. The inhabitants, rather than being captured and enslaved, chose mass suicide. Numantia quickly became this powerful, romantic symbol of fierce Spanish independence and patriotism, celebrated by Spanish patriots for centuries.
Yet the people who are celebrating the memory of the Numantian resistance, they're doing so in Spanish, which is a Latin-derived language.
They utilize Roman law, they follow the Roman Catholic Church, and their architecture, their political structures, even their concepts of citizenship, they owe far more to the Roman legacy than to the vanquished Celtic culture of the Numantians. The Roman conquest was so total that the victors co-opted the very memory of the vanquished.
The paradox is that you celebrate your freedom using the tools of your former oppressor.
That is the imperial cycle, and it's repeated globally right up to the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century. Subject peoples, they adopt the imperial culture, Latin, English, human rights, socialism, and then they use those shared values to demand equal status.
The famous example is Mohandas Gandhi.
Of course. He was a product of the British imperial system. He mastered English law, he adopted Western manners, yet when he insisted on traveling first class on a train in South Africa, he was violently thrown off for being a colored man. The anti-colonial struggles that followed were fought under the banners of self-determination and human rights values that were, ironically, Western imperial legacies. They used the master's tools to dismantle the master's house.
And this creates a severe cultural inheritance problem for modern states. The modern Indian state, for instance, is an undeniable child of the British Empire. You have democracy, the English lingua franca, the railway network, institutions like the civil service.
So this forces some really difficult choices. If a Hindu nationalist decides to destroy buildings left by the British, like Mumbai's neo-Gothic Victoria Station, where does that destruction stop? What about the structures left by older conquerors, like the Mughal Empire's Taj Mahal?
It's impossible to untangle.
It is. We are forced to acknowledge the complexity. Trying to rescue some authentic past often just means sanctioning the legacies of an older, no less brutal empire. The sources conclude that in history, we really struggle to divide the past into simple good guys and bad guys, unless we're willing to admit that we usually follow the lead of the bad guys.
So these forces of unification, money, empire, law, they led directly to the next monumental shift in human history.
Yeah.
The scientific revolution, which began around AD 1500. And to grasp the sheer acceleration of history this era brought, I think the time travel thought experiment is really effective.
It is. A Spanish peasant traveling from the year 1000 to the year 1500 would find the world relatively familiar.
Same tools, same social hierarchy, same farming methods.
Basically. But a sailor who was with Columbus in 1500, if he woke up in the 21st century, would be utterly bewildered, just stunned by electricity, global travel, the sheer noise and speed of the modern world.
And the defining change here wasn't just a series of new discoveries, but rather the discovery of ignorance.
That's the core scientific ethic. It's a total paradigm shift. For the first time, Europe adopted a systematic willingness to admit what it didn't know. Before 1500, if an intellectual didn't know something, they just assumed the answer was somewhere in the Bible, or in Aristotle, or in some other ancient text. If you didn't find the answer, it was your failure. You hadn't looked hard enough.
But the scientific ethic changed this.
It did. It made it acceptable. In fact, it's celebrated. The idea of drawing maps with spaces left to fill in. It was an admission of true, systematic ignorance, and it created the drive to seek new powers through methodical research.
And this intellectual curiosity just accelerated history almost instantly.
The speed of progress is almost unbelievable. Circumnavigating the globe took Ferdinand Magellan 3 painstaking, deadly years in 1522. By 1873, Jules Verne could realistically imagine it taking 80 days. Today, a middle-class traveler can safely and comfortably do it in 48 hours.
And this breakneck acquisition of knowledge only happened because science found partners.
Right. Science does not operate in a vacuum. It requires an alliance.
What kind of alliance?
An alliance with ideology or religion, which justifies the immense cost and effort, and an alliance with politics and economics, which provide the resources and, crucially, set the research agenda. This creates a powerful, self-sustaining feedback loop, where scientific discoveries feed capital, which funds more science, which then enhances military and political power.
And you can see this feedback loop most clearly in the fundamental shift in warfare. Ancient armies, they relied on organization and discipline, and their technology was stagnant for centuries.
If the legions of Scipio Aemilianus suddenly popped up 5 centuries later, they would still have been highly effective against the legions of Constantine. The change was that slow. But you fast forward to the scientific revolution. If Napoleon's troops faced a modern armored brigade, their superior organization and discipline would be completely and utterly useless. Technology, fueled by science and capital, is now the overwhelming driver of warfare.
And this alliance wasn't just about destructive power. It was also about logistics and saving lives, especially when it served imperial interests.
Yes, the problem of scurvy is a tragic but perfect example. Scurvy killed an estimated 2 million sailors between the 16th and 18th centuries. A staggering toll. This wasn't just a human tragedy, it was a major logistical problem for maritime empires.
Right. It limited how far they could project power.
Exactly. So, James Lind, a British physician, conducted a controlled experiment in 1747 and showed that citrus fruit cured the disease, even though the mechanism, vitamin C, wasn't understood then.
But the scientific discovery wasn't immediately adopted, was it?
It wasn't, which is a lesson in itself. The Royal Navy was slow to adopt the findings, but Captain James Cook, who was a keen adopter of scientific thinking, he resolved to prove it worked. He loaded his ship with sauerkraut and required his sailors to eat fresh produce whenever they could. And Cook famously did not lose a single sailor to scurvy on his long, arduous voyages.
That one scientific breakthrough, plus the political will to implement it, saved countless lives.
And it made long-range imperial projection possible. Conversely, the same feedback loop fueled destructive industrial power, perhaps most chillingly through the work of the chemist Fritz Haber.
The Nobel Prize winner.
The Nobel Prize winner, yes. He was a Jewish chemist who developed the process to produce ammonia out of thin air. Now, ammonia is essential for explosives. It replaced saltpeter, which was a resource that Germany had been blockaded from accessing during World War I. Some historians argue that Haber's discovery was the critical factor that kept Germany in the fight until late 1918.
And this continued into the next war.
It did. During WWII, the German government invested heavily in so-called miracle weapons like the V-2 rocket, believing that technology alone would grant them ultimate victory. The war machine was, by then, fundamentally driven by the scientific quest for superior power.
And this constant exponential need for funding and for technological escalation, it's tied directly to the core philosophy of the next great imagined order, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution.
The foundational capitalist ethic is simple. But at the time, it was radical. The profits of production must be reinvested in increasing production. Today, this sounds like common sense, but it was totally alien to pre-modern times.
Right. A medieval nobleman made a profit, but he spent it.
He spent it on banquets, elaborate cathedrals, or wars. He viewed production as essentially constant, or maybe cyclic. Very few people ever thought of reinvesting profits to develop better machinery or find new markets.
So the Industrial Revolution was the inevitable result of this shift in thinking, fueled by new ways to convert energy.
The demand for coal in Britain around 1700 was immense, driven by population growth and deforestation, and this led to a critical logistical problem. The coal mines were constantly flooding with water. The solution was the steam engine, a machine that converted heat into motion, specifically to pump water out of the mines.
So it solved an acute economic problem.
And in doing so, it ushered in the entire industrial age. It created an almost endless supply of cheap energy, and that was paired with new raw materials, like the ammonia provided by Haber's process.
But the requirement for a constant increase in production, that necessitated a profound shift in social ethics. It created consumerism.
It had to. Historically, frugality was seen as a moral virtue. A good person patched their torn trousers, they saved their money, they avoided luxuries. Capitalism needed to reverse this deeply ingrained ethic. Frugality was replaced by the moral imperative to buy products, to consume, thereby fueling the demand that was required by the constantly increasing supply.
And this new ethic created a brand new contemporary class divide.
Exactly. Today, the wealthy elite, they manage assets, they save money, and they reinvest profits. They adhere to the original capitalist ethic of production. Meanwhile, the less well-heeled, the vast majority of us, are systematically encouraged to go into debt buying cars and televisions they don't really need. We adhere to the modern consumerist ethic of consumption. The system demands different, often contradictory ethical behaviors from different classes.
And all these massive changes, science, capitalism, consumerism, they led to the most momentous social revolution of the industrial era, the collapse of the intimate, kin-based community.
For over 1 million years, human social life was dominated by small, kin-based groups. The community provided virtually every need: building your hut, guarding your sheep, medical assistance, protection, education. And it was all done primarily through favors and tradition, with very few market transactions required.
But the Industrial Revolution and mass urbanization just shattered that structure in 2 centuries.
It was incredibly fast, and the state and the market, they just rushed in to fill that vacuum. They became, in effect, the mother and father of the individual.
How so?
They took over all the traditional community roles. The state provides work, pensions, education, and loans. The market provides goods, insurance, and medical care. And crucially, this system recognizes individuals, including women, with rights that are independent of their family or community ownership.
So there's a liberation there.
There is a liberation from the often oppressive, sometimes violent, control of the kin group, but it comes at a massive cost. The loss of those strong community bonds leads to widespread alienation.
And the impersonal state and the market now have this unprecedented power to intervene in what used to be private life.
Absolutely. Parental authority is in full retreat. Parents are forced to send their children to state schools, the state dictates standards of care, and it can intervene to restrain abusive parents. All things that would have been unthinkable in a pre-modern society where the local community was the ultimate authority.
And to fill the emotional and spiritual void left by these collapsed intimate communities, the state and the market, they foster new, large-scale, imagined communities of millions of strangers.
And the two key replacements are the nation, which is the imagined community of the state, and the consumer tribe, which is the imagined community of the market.
And the nation is often just manufactured out of whole cloth.
Often haphazardly. European diplomats, for example, arbitrarily drew borders on a map, creating Iraqis from the disparate peoples of Kurdistan, Baghdad, and Basra. Saddam Hussein then had to co-opt ancient heritage, like the Babylonian and Abbasid empires, as raw materials for a national identity that was essentially, in a political sense, only a couple of months old. He had to create a story, a 2-month-old cake.
And the consumer tribe can be just as strong, if not stronger, than national allegiance.
Oh, for sure. Today, being a consumer of a specific brand or adhering to a certain lifestyle, like being a German vegetarian, can be a far stronger, more immediate identity bond than simply being a German carnivore. The entire social order now exists in what the sources call a state of permanent flux. The promise of modern politics isn't to conserve tradition, but to constantly engineer, to destroy the old world and build a better one. And this breakneck speed leads us to the final, ultimate act of engineering, the engineering of life itself.
So, the final part of our deep dive takes us right to the present and into the very near future. We've established that human history is this series of escalating miscalculations and powerful fictions. And the sources now challenge one final, comforting assumption: that history naturally trends toward human well-being or happiness.
Yeah, we need to be really careful not to judge past lives through the lens of a wealthy 21st century Westerner. Historically, the individual human is just too ignorant and too weak to significantly influence history to their own advantage. And we have to question the history of happiness itself.
What do you mean?
Is happiness a genuine state of well-being, or is it based on these fleeting pleasures, the neural feedback loops that our DNA uses to manipulate us? It's almost like a temporary heroin addiction that our genes give us to ensure we fulfill our purpose of surviving and reproducing.
Or is it, as the Buddhist approach might suggest, based on understanding and accepting the impermanent nature of feelings and desires? We just don't have the metrics to judge whether a peasant from 1500 was truly happier than a stressed executive today.
That's the critical point. We are only just beginning to study the history of happiness. But the trajectory of life itself is about to fundamentally change, moving way beyond the question of historical happiness. For 4 billion years, life on this planet evolved through the blind, undirected process of natural selection. Now, for the first time, we are directly challenging that regime through intelligent design, and we're doing it via 3 primary methods of engineering.
The first is biological engineering. This is deliberate intervention to modify organisms based on our own cultural ideas.
And we've gone far beyond traditional selective breeding. Modern examples include Alba, the famous fluorescent green rabbit. She was engineered by implanting a gene taken from a fluorescent jellyfish directly into a rabbit embryo. We're creating organisms that fulfill our aesthetic or commercial desires.
We're also manipulating organisms at the cellular level, creating these modern chimeras.
Think back to that 30,000-year-old lion man statue, this fantasy of a composite being. Well, in 1996, we all saw that highly publicized image of the mouse with a human-engineered ear grown from cattle cartilage cells on its back. This realization of a composite being is both fascinating and deeply, deeply challenging.
And looking ahead.
Looking ahead, geneticists have already engineered so-called genius mice, demonstrating improved memory and learning skills just by altering their genes. They have also isolated the specific genes for monogamy in voles.
And given that the Sapiens genome is only about 14% larger than the mouse genome, 2.9 billion nucleobases versus 2.5 billion, the possibility of genetically engineering genius or hardwired emotional traits like faithfulness in humans is approaching very, very fast. We are gaining the ability to control not just our bodies, but our mental and our emotional capacities.
The second area is cyborg engineering. This is the combination of organic and non-organic parts. We already see this in military applications. DARPA, for instance, is developing insect cyborg flies or cockroaches outfitted with microchips and sensors to act as tiny eavesdropping devices. The NUWC is developing cyborg sharks controlled via neural implants to perform surveillance and identify underwater electromagnetic fields.
But the most profound change, that comes from the development of the direct two-way brain-computer interface. This is what changes the very concept of the self.
This technology allows computers to read the brain's electrical signals and simultaneously transmit signals that the brain perceives as sensory input, or even as memory. This opens the door to what some call the interbrain net, linking human brains directly to the internet or, and this is crucial, directly to each other.
And if one cyborg can directly experience and remember the memories of another, what happens to concepts like the self, individuality, gender identity?
It raises truly existential questions. How can you know thyself if your earliest childhood memories might be shared, or if your emotional aspirations reside in some collective digital reservoir? Such a being would be fundamentally post-human.
It's hard to even imagine.
And the third pathway is the engineering of inorganic life. Computer programs and viruses, they already demonstrate independent evolution. They adapt and they change without direct human direction.
And genetic programming aims to create programs that can learn and evolve entirely independently of their creators, essentially becoming artificial life forms.
And then there is the massive undertaking of the Human Brain Project, which received a huge $1 billion grant from the EU. The goal is audacious, to recreate a complete, fully functional human brain inside a computer within a decade or two. If they are successful, life will have successfully broken out of the small world of organic compounds, this carbon-based existence that has defined all life on Earth, and it will enter the vast inorganic realm of silicon and code.
And this speed of change is the definition of the upcoming singularity, a point where the known laws of nature and the concepts that define our social world, like me and you, they just become irrelevant. It's forcing us to rethink everything, from morality to politics, and even what constitutes a healthy lifespan. 60 is becoming the new 30, and we are racing just to keep up.
The future masters of the world, if they emerge from this intelligent design process, will be godlike. They'll be potentially more different from us than we are from Neanderthals. And we find this deep comfort in the old story of Dr. Frankenstein creating a terrible monster that we must destroy.
Why is that story so comforting?
Because that narrative confirms our self-belief, that humans are the best possible beings and that the human spirit is somehow sacred and untouchable.
But the hard truth that we struggle to swallow is that future scientists could engineer not just superior bodies, but superior minds and superior spirits as well. They could create entities that are truly superior to us. They might look at us as condescendingly as we now look back at the simple, muscle-bound Neanderthals. #shag outro. We begin this deep dive exploring the paradox of our large, costly brains, which only paid off when they were coupled with the narrow-hipped social structures required to raise our dependent young. We then tracked how true mass cooperation, the basis of modern cities and armies, was achieved not through biological instinct, but entirely through shared myths and imagined orders like money, laws, and empires.
We watched history accelerate during the scientific revolution, driven by that alliance of capital and military necessity, plunging our social order into a state of permanent flux. And this flux systematically collapsed our intimate communities, replacing them with global state and market systems, which has led us directly to the current era, the engineering of life itself.
We stand, according to the material we've synthesized, on the threshold of replacing natural selection with intelligent design. We're poised to engineer not just our bodies, but the very intellectual and emotional capacities that define who we are. We are, as one source says, moving nervously between the gateway of heaven and the anteroom of hell. And we know that the most successful cultures are not always the best ones for human happiness.
And that leaves us with the ultimate question. The individuals caught between the self-interested programs of their DNA and the self-propagating demands of their culture's memes. When you realize that your political beliefs, your consumer desires, and even your deepest feelings are, to a large extent, programs running inside a highly evolved organism. What is the source of genuine unengineered meaning for you, the individual, when the very ability to define humanity itself is becoming an engineering problem?
A deeply unsettling yet essential question to ponder as technology accelerates. Something to mull over until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us.